Hi, I'm Dan Toomey, and welcome to my session on hybrid connectivity. In today's IT landscape, we're seeing more and more hybrid applications. And what we mean by that is applications that are hosted both in the cloud and on-prem. Enterprises are taking advantage of Microsoft Azure for the scalability and global reach and sometimes the cost savings they can get by moving some of their resources up to the cloud, even when other resources, like their line of business systems, have to stay on-prem. Of course, this poses a very challenging integration scenario where connectivity becomes a real issue. Fortunately, Microsoft Azure has a number of solutions that help to support this. In fact, there's quite a few of them now, and some of them don't even require changes to your corporate network. The problem with choice, though, is that you need to understand what the differences are between the different options so that you can make the best choice. So in this presentation, I'd like to take you on a brief tour of all the various offerings that Microsoft has in the hopes of being able to help you make a better informed decision about which tech to use for which scenario. Just a few words about myself. I'm a principal consultant for Mexia. Mexia is an enterprise integration consultancy in Australia. We're a Microsoft Gold partner, and I'm happy to say that this year we were Microsoft's Partner of the Year in Australia. I'm also a Microsoft MVP and an MCT. Just to set the scope of what this talk is about, this is not a session on hybrid integration patterns. It is specifically on connectivity, and that means the real-time connectivity, not the asynchronous kind where you're using service bus, queues, or topics. That's certainly a valid approach, but that's just not the scope of what I'm talking about here. Also, due to the time constraint, I only have about 30 minutes, I won't be able to do any demos, so this will be a theoretical talk only. Finally, I am going to mention some of the network-level connectivity options that you have, like VNets, but that's not going to be the primary focus of this talk. And the reason is, one, it's not really my area of specialty, and two, as a developer and architect, I'm really much more interested in the options that don't require network changes because I feel that you have so much more autonomy in that case. You don't have to rely on the governance and the policies that go into effect when an enterprise needs to make changes to their corporate network. I find that things tend to happen a lot faster that way. So really, a better title for the talk probably would have been this, but it doesn't sound anywhere near as catchy. So when we talk about hybrid connectivity solutions, we can basically sort them into two different categories. The first category would be those that are based on networks, like VNets, and the others are ones that don't require any particular changes to your corporate network. So we'll start with the network-based options first. Virtual networks are nothing new. They've been around for a long time. I guess the difference now is that Azure makes it so much easier to set them up and get them going. You can actually automate that through ARM templates, which is pretty cool. But it is important to understand what the different types of VNets that there are on offer. So the first one, the point-to-site, is really about joining a specific PC or a computer to an existing network. So if you've ever remoted into work, where you joined your company's VM and then remote desktop into your machines, that's an example of a point-to-site network. A site-to-site network is when you actually have two completely separate networks in themselves, and they're joined together, usually by a VPN gateway, like a physical device. The thing to be aware of is that both of these options travel over the public internet. And as such, there's some unpredictability in terms of the performance because you're at the mercy of what the internet is doing at the time. If you want real predictability, then the third option is actually much better. ExpressRoute is a case where you're actually renting space on an existing cable. So you can think of it as stretching a giant dedicated cable between your network and wherever it is that you're connecting to. Because it's operating on dedicated line, performance is very, very predictable. It's also a bit expensive. VNet integration is an option where if you're running a web or a mobile app, you can quite easily join that app to an existing virtual network. Now, there's some restrictions on it. You have to be running in a standard or premium app service plan. The virtual network has to be in the same subscription as your app service plan, and you must have point-to-site enabled. Even if your VNet is using site-to-site, you just have to enable point-to-site so that web app or mobile app can join it, because effectively it is just that machine that web app or mobile app is running on that's being added to the network. You also have to have dynamic routing gateway enabled. Now, one thing to be aware when you're doing this is that anyone who can access your website now has a window into your corporate network. So you need to design your applications with security in mind with that. So in that case, you might want to look at a setup more like this. This is a far more robust option because it uses API management in front of the gateway to control access to it. API management also gives you a bunch of add-on features like caching, agility, protocol translation, analytics. And in this scenario, we're not only using API management, but we're also using application gateway in front of it, which gives you even more features, including web application firewall. This would be a very, very secure way to control external clients' access into your corporate network. Now I'd like to move on to the non-network-based options. To embrace these options, you really need to understand the concept of relay, because relay is really the pattern or technology that underpins all of these options. So let's explain for a moment what relay is, because it's worthwhile understanding that before we go much further. Getting messages out of your corporate network is usually not a problem. Most enterprises allow internet connectivity, usually on the standard ports 80 or 443. If they don't, then chances are they're not very interested in hybrid connectivity. So getting messages out is not a problem. The usual challenge is getting messages into a corporate network, because to do that, those messages have to traverse a number of boundaries that are set up to protect the network. For example, load balancers and firewalls and routers, and usually multiple layers of that. Relay solves this problem in a very clever way. If you want to allow clients to access your resources within your corporate network, then what you do is you establish an outbound connection from within your network to a listening endpoint that's hosted in the cloud. When you make that accessible to your clients through secure means, they can connect to that endpoint, and then what you have is a rendezvous point, for which clients can then send messages via that rendezvous point into your corporate network. And you can send messages back, so it's bidirectional. I really like Michael Stevenson's description of this. He calls it a secure router in the sky, which is pretty much what it is. The important thing is that because it's established through an outbound connection, there's no changes required to your corporate network, provided that they already allow outbound internet connectivity. Not surprisingly, the first technology I'm going to talk about is called Azure Relay. This became generally available in March of this year after a very short time in preview. It's one of the 3 offerings that are with Azure Service Bus, the others being Event Hubs and, of course, queues and topics. Azure Relay is in itself composed of 2 separate services. One is the WCF Relay, which has actually been around as long as Service Bus has been around. In fact, it's exactly the same thing as Service Bus Relay. It really hasn't changed. They've just changed the name to fit it under the Azure Relay umbrella. The other one is the Azure Relay Hybrid Connections. Now, you may remember the Hybrid Connections offering that was available through Microsoft Azure BizTalk Services. That was a preview feature, but if you don't know already, BizTalk Services has now been retired. You can't create any more instances of that, and if you have any existing instances, you'll need to migrate them before the 31st of May next year. Azure Relay Hybrid Connections is a new offering of that very same feature, but hosted in Service Bus instead of BizTalk Services, and it's been overhauled and improved tremendously. As I mentioned before, WCF Relay is not new. It's been around as long as Service Bus has. So as you can gather from the title, it relies on WCF, which necessarily means that you need a Windows service. So what you do is you set up a Service Bus namespace in Azure, and then you host a WCF service within your corporate network using one of the bindings that are here to connect it to that namespace. And this sets up the outbound connection and the listener endpoint for which your clients can then connect to. Security for WCF Relay was originally ACS, which is Access Control Services, but now it supports shared access signatures, which is a much more standard way of doing security now. I believe ACS is still supported, though. The great thing about WCF Relay is that it can be consumed by a number of different services and tech. For starters, any service in Azure can connect to it, but also external cloud sources such as Salesforce, for example, can also connect to it, as long as you can give them the endpoint. And if you were to host a BizTalk server in your corporate network, that's an even better story, because not only can that set up the WCF Relay for you without having to write your own service, but it also allows you to connect to any number of your line of business systems within your corporate network. Obviously, because it relies on WCF, you need the .NET framework to support this, and you also need a Windows server to host it. You also need to actually write the service yourself, so it doesn't come out of the box, unless, of course, you're using BizTalk Server, which has an adapter for it. And finally, WCF Relay is really optimized for XML messaging. It doesn't mean you can only send XML messages, it just means that it's optimized for that. The pricing is really a great story with WCF Relay. In this example, if you had a relay that was running 24/7 for an entire month, and during that month you spent 1 million messages across that relay, well, that would be your bill. Now, obviously, that's not taking into account any data egress charges, which may come into play, especially if you're going cross data centers. And the message size is limited to 64 kilobyte in this example. But still, you've got to admit that is a pretty insignificant cost to pay for that kind of connectivity. WCF Relay is by far the cheapest option for establishing hybrid connectivity. The next tech I want to look at is hybrid connections. Now, this is different than WCF Relay because it works at a much lower level. It actually works with web sockets. Now, the great thing about that is it gives you a lot more flexibility in terms of platform. You don't have to rely on any particular application framework like WCF or .NET. In fact, you don't even have to rely on a particular operating system. It's truly cross-platform. Anything that can talk TCP over WebSockets can use hybrid connections. The way hybrid connections works is it relies on port forwarding, where you identify your target via a host name and a port number. If you remember how it worked with BizTalk services, it was a codeless experience. You could connect your web apps and mobile apps without having to write any extra code or even changing your configuration. That's still the case with this hybrid connections. However, it's been expanded to include an API, which makes it accessible in a number of other scenarios as well. The way it works is if you want to connect to a corporate resource, you identify that corporate resource by a host name and a port number, and then you create a hybrid connection in Azure based on that host name and port. Once you have the hybrid connection, you can then download a listener agent that you install on a server somewhere in your network. It doesn't have to be on the same server as the resource you're trying to connect to, as long as it has visibility of it over the network. Then you simply configure that hybrid connection manager to talk to your on-prem systems. The last step is to hook up your web app or your mobile app to that hybrid connection. It's extremely easy to set up, there are no changes required to your corporate network, and it truly is a lift and shift scenario. Another great thing about hybrid connections is how scalable it is. If you're worried about high availability, typically your backend resource will be clustered. That's fine, because when you're identifying the host name and port number, you can simply identify the cluster by its name. So once you've established high availability for your backend system, the concern then would be with the hybrid connection itself. Well, hybrid connection in Azure being hosted in Service Bus is automatically scalable, and you don't even have to worry about that. Service Bus is extremely resilient. So the point of weakness then becomes the hybrid connection manager itself. The good thing is that you can install multiple hybrid connection managers in your corporate network on different machines and connect them all to the same hybrid connection. And it will work. Hybrid connections will actually load balance across those connection managers in a round-robin approach. So you have full high availability. Now, That feature of working with web apps and mobile apps was available in the original classic hybrid connections with BizTalk services. But the new version not only supports that, but it also supports the option of connecting your Azure VMs. This wasn't an option before. The way it does this is by exposing an API. Now, there's some sample code that's available out on GitHub that you can download and freely use. And one of the samples is the port bridge code option. And what you do is you establish your hybrid connection, as you normally do in Azure, but then you deploy some server agent code in your on-prem server and some client agent code in your Azure VM, and this enables you to talk across that hybrid connection. This solution enables you to connect almost anything. Here's the link for the GitHub site where you can download the code to do this. As far as constraints go with hybrid connections, well, there really aren't that many. I mean, there is a maximum number of relay endpoints you can set up per namespace, but 10,000 seems like a fairly extreme amount. And if you're going to have more than 25 listeners per relay, chances are you're not looking at a hybrid connection kind of scenario. This is more of a multicast type of broadcast situation where you would probably want to handle that through events, for example. It does work best for Azure-hosted clients. And the codeless experience is still limited to the web and mobile apps. But of course, you now have the flexibility with just a little bit of code to be able to connect almost anything else. Hybrid connections is definitely more expensive than WCF relays. So you will pay $10 per listener that you set up. And the listener, of course, is that agent that you have running on-prem. With the first listener, you get 5 gigabyte of data per month. That's not a lot, and every gigabyte over that will cost you $1. That may not seem like an excessive charge, but if you're going to be sending terabytes of data, then clearly this is not going to be a very economical solution, and you'd probably be wanting to look at another option, like either WCF Relay or a network-based option in that case. Choosing which Azure Relay to use relies on you understanding the difference about where they operate. So remember that hybrid connections works at a very low level, layer 4 transport, actually. So while it's very flexible in terms of the operating systems, as in you can run it on Linux as opposed to Windows, and it has no dependency at all on an application framework, that also means that you can't take advantage of anything that an application framework like WCF would offer you. For example, if you wanted to accommodate security and reliable messaging and transactions, etc., you would probably want to use the WCF relay. The other thing is that hybrid connection gives you a very, very fixed scope. You remember that you're targeting a specific host on a specific port. With WCF Relay, you actually have much more flexibility in terms of what that scope could be. For example, you could narrow it down to a specific operation that runs on a service on a specific port, or you can use a WCF router, for example, and broadcast messages out to multiple different systems in your enterprise. So these are things to keep in mind when you're choosing one over the other. The last technology I want to talk about is the on-premises data gateway. Now, this is the solution for PaaS-based integrations. So if you're using Logic Apps, Power Apps, Flow, or Power BI, the on-premises data gateway is an add-on that allows you to bridge connections between your Azure-hosted PaaS solution and your on-prem resources. This became generally available in May this year. Now, the great thing about Logic Apps and Power Apps is that there's over 180 connectors available to connect to all kinds of different SaaS systems. In fact, you'd be hard-pressed to find one that wasn't available. If the backend system that you want to connect to on your on-prem network is one of those listed here, then those connectors support the on-premises data gateway, and they can make it very, very easy for you to bridge that connection. So here's an example of a connector for BizTalk Server, and you can see that you have the option to use an on-premise data gateway. And then simply by providing the authorization credentials for your on-prem BizTalk server, you can establish that connection without having to set up any other infrastructure or making any network changes. So like hybrid connections with web apps and mobile apps, this is a codeless solution for establishing that connectivity. The way it works is just slightly different than hybrid connections. In this case, you actually download and install the gateway on-prem first and configure that. Then you can register the gateway in Azure, and then connect your logic apps and power apps to consume that gateway. If you want really high performance, you can run it over ExpressRoute, but that's not strictly required. Some constraints with the on-prem data gateway, so it's only accessible from within the specific managed connectors that can utilize an on-prem data gateway. So you can't write your own API or connector and leverage one of these, at least not yet. You can only install one gateway per machine, and that can't be a domain controller. There are some restrictions to the accounts that you can use, and at the moment there's no support for high availability, but that is on the roadmap, so eventually we'll see that come. The great thing about the on-premises data gateway pricing is that it's absolutely free. You don't pay any extra to use the data gateway with your managed connectors. Of course, you do pay for the services that use it, though. So with logic apps, for example, in this scenario, you pay per action that executes in a logic app, which includes an action that is a connector. That $500 may look expensive, but that's a scenario where you're having 1 million actions performed over the course of a month. And that's a lot of logic app actions. For the rest of the presentation, I'd like to run through a few scenarios so we can highlight different examples of hybrid connectivity and which tech is best to service it. The first scenario is the very basic web app that needs to connect to an on-prem SQL Server database. Now, if you've been paying attention, it shouldn't be hard to guess that the best solution for this would typically be a hybrid connection. They're super easy to configure, they're relatively inexpensive, they require no network reconfiguration, and in many times it doesn't even require any changes in your application configuration. This supports a truly lift and shift scenario where if your website worked on-prem, once you deploy it as a web app and set up a hybrid connection, it will continue to work without even changing the connection strings. Reasons why you might not use a hybrid connection? Well, if you wanted to take advantage of some of the features in the WCF framework, that would be a good idea then to use the WCF Relay. Also, if you were going to be moving large amounts of data, the WCF Relay would definitely be cheaper. If you're going to rely on Active Directory authentication, and by Active Directory I mean an on-prem Active Directory, then I'm afraid that neither the WCF Relay or the hybrid connections is going to support that. You'll really need to rely then on a network solution like a VNet. The second scenario I want to cover is an IaaS situation. This is where you have a virtual machine that's running in the cloud and it needs to connect to your on-prem resources. That virtual machine could be running any custom application you have, or it might be running something like BizTalk Server. Now, if this was a year ago, the only option available to you would have been a WCF Relay or a VNet option. But now, with the new hybrid connections, you can actually deploy the PortBridge code and use that to connect your VM to an on-prem resource. This does require a little bit of custom code, but it's mostly from that GitHub sample, and you'll find that the majority of changes that you make will be configuration changes only. Reasons for choosing something other than a hybrid connection are very, very similar to the website. You would use a WCF Relay if you wanted to take advantage of some of the application features in there. You could also use a logic app and an on-prem data gateway if the system that you want to connect to in your back end is supported by a managed connector that utilizes the on-prem data gateway. Again, if you're going to be moving a large amount of data or you need to take advantage of Active Directory authentication, your VNet is probably the only option. The third scenario is connecting a SaaS service to on-prem. So in this example, we have Salesforce that needs to talk to your back-end SAP system. This should be screaming out to you to use a logic app and an on-prem data gateway. The reason is that logic apps were born for this. They were designed with all of their connectors to be able to make it easy to connect to a whole variety of SaaS systems. You'd be hard-pressed to find one that isn't supported by a managed connector. And if your back-end system has a connector and logic apps that supports the on-prem data gateway, then this makes it extremely simple. There's no code in this solution. It's just configuring those connectors. Now, of course, You could always use a WCF relay if you wanted to do that, if you can get your SaaS client to talk to that. Hybrid connections would be a much more challenging way to do that, I think. But another option, if you're going to use a VNet, is to use the API gateway, because then you could take advantage of all those other features that API management offers you in terms of caching and policy and message transformation. The fourth scenario is a bit different in that we're not actually connecting a cloud-hosted resource to your on-prem network, but rather another on-prem network from a partner, for example. But Azure still features in this because that provides the solution, in this case, via a logic app and an on-prem data gateway. This is a great solution, again, if the on-prem system that you're hosting is supported by one of the managed connectors that can leverage the on-prem data gateway. A logic app can expose many different kinds of endpoints, including HTTP endpoints that your partner network can actually consume. This is a fully PaaS solution, and if necessary, it can support EDI as well. An add-on feature with Logic Apps is the Enterprise Integration Pack, and with this, you can host schemas and maps, as well as trading partner agreements and profiles. The great thing about this is that you can actually validate your messages and even transform them before they even arrive in your corporate network by leveraging the resources that you would host within the Enterprise Integration Pack. And the Enterprise Integration Pack also fully supports EDI, so you have connectors that would support Edifact, X12, and also AS2. Alternatives for achieving this would be using an API gateway with a VNet and allowing your clients to reach endpoints within the API gateway, or you can get them to consume a WCF relay, as we've mentioned before. But if you're going to support EDI, there would be a lot of custom code that you'd have to write, and you'd have to question why you'd want to do that, as opposed to using the built-in connectors that are available with Logic Apps. The last scenario I want to go over is when you're hosting a microservices architecture in a Service Fabric cluster in Azure, and that needs to connect to your backend system. Well, if you think about it, what is Service Fabric but a bunch of virtual machines? So the connectivity that would work with an IaaS virtual machine should work with a Service Fabric cluster, and in that case, I'd be inclined to give hybrid connections a shot. Again, using the PortBridge solution, you can install the client agent on your nodes in Service Fabric and use that to connect to the server agent, which we hosted on-prem. Now, I've never done this myself in production yet, so it's still a bit of a theoretical option, but I think it's one worthy of trying. Other options, of course, you could set up a WCF relay. You could use a Logic app and an on-prem data gateway if you hosted that somewhere and your Service Fabric wanted to hit that endpoint. And of course, a VNet is always an option, and the only option if you want to use Active Directory authentication. And perhaps if you want to move massive amounts of data or have very predictable latency, then you would probably use ExpressRoute. On this slide, I've sort of changed the view around a little bit so that you look at each technology and you list the strengths for it so that you can use this as a method of determining what it is that you want to support. I understand these slides will be available, so you can look at these later and go through them in detail. I've also included a bit of a cost-effort comparison. So this chart basically plots the amount of development effort that's required in relation to the ongoing monthly cost for running that particular service. So you can see that WCF Relay is pretty high up there on the dev effort in terms of you have to write your own WCF service, whereas the hybrid connection costs a little bit more, but is extremely low or almost zero development effort. The solutions that use virtual networks, and especially ones that use the API management or the application gateway, obviously are getting up there in the expensive range, but there are a lot of benefits that come with that as well, particularly in regards to security. I've listed here a bunch of references for you, so feel free to browse these. Hopefully these slides will be available to you. And a particular note is the relay samples that are available on GitHub, which is the last link I've given you there. If you're interested in learning more about hybrid connections, there is a Pluralsight course out there written by someone who really likes hybrid connections. Unfortunately, it's a little bit dated. So this is really focused on the BizTalk services offering of hybrid connections, which you can't create anymore. So you'd need to skip the module that talks about provisioning a BizTalk services instance. However, the rest of the course is still quite relevant in terms of the examples it gives of setting up a web app or a mobile app to use a hybrid connection. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation, and please feel free to reach out to me on any of these channels if you have any questions. Thanks for taking the time to listen, and have a great day.